I have a little brother who was in high school at the time. For his privacy, I'll call him Sam. He had been saving up money to buy a gaming PC since all of his friends had one. His budget was around $800 to $1,000. He had a hard time finding one that he liked after looking on several sites. I offered to let him use my Craigslist account to search for one, since you could sometimes run into really good deals. He ended up finding a great deal after he came across a listing for an unused PC that was built by the seller. I'm not too savvy with computers, but Sam told me that most of the computers of that type usually went for at least $1,200. I messaged the seller, who went by Tim, to meet up so Sam could take a look at it. The next morning, I got a response from Tim. He told me that it was still available and asked me when I'd like to meet up. I texted Sam, who was in school at the time, and sent him the screenshot from my conversation with the seller. He replied during lunch and told me that he could meet up with Tim after track practice around 7. I went back and forth with the seller as I relayed the messages to Sam throughout the rest of his school day. They both agreed to meet up outside of the Walmart by our house at 7:30. Around 6:45, Sam came home from practice. He showered and ate, then left to go meet up with Tim. Being the older sister, I wanted to look out for Sam, so I asked him to share his location with me on his iPhone so I'd be able to keep an eye on him. He reluctantly turned it on and left to go to Walmart. Once it was 7:30, I pulled out my phone to make sure Sam had made it. Surely enough, I saw his dot on the screen towards the back of the parking lot. I kept my phone near me as I finished up the last bits of my homework. At 7:40, I received a disturbing text from Tim through my messages on Craigslist. The text read, "Sam fainted." I responded frantically within the same minute saying, "What do you mean he fainted? Is he okay?" A couple minutes went by with no response, and I started getting really worried. I tried calling Sam's phone, but it would just ring and go to voicemail. I texted him, asking if he was okay, but there was no response. Now panicking, I got in my car and sped over to the Walmart. As I pulled in, I spotted his car parked under a light pole, but there weren't any cars nearby. I checked my phone to see his exact location, as I fully realized something terrible was happening. His dot on the location had moved way east, and he was now no longer near the Walmart. I got directions to his location and began driving towards it. On the way, I called my mom, who had just gotten back home with my dad, and explained the situation to them. In the background, I could hear my dad on the phone with the police. He was frantically trying to explain the situation to them, but the sheer panic we all felt made it hard to do so. I continued to drive to Sam, knowing that I wouldn't be able to live with myself if something terrible had happened to him. His dot on the location had moved way east, in a suburban area, just minutes away from the elementary school I used to go to. My dad grabbed my mom's phone and asked for the address, in which I was able to read off of the black mailbox in front of the house. It was a small, one-story house, but it looked completely dark from the outside. My dad screamed at me not to go in, but I did anyway. As I walked in, the house was extremely dark. A small candle sitting in the middle of the living room provided the only light in the house. I noticed that the rooms were bare. There was no furniture, curtains, or any sign of anyone living there. I yelled out for Sam, and he responded, screaming my name back. Right as I heard him, I heard a door to the backyard slam shut. I crept towards the sound, where I was able to see the dark shadow of someone running away in the backyard. I found Sam in the basement, who was locked down there in a storage room. I hugged him, just relieved that he was alive and okay. The police showed up a minute later and searched the house, but the person was already gone. Sam and I were taken to the police station, where we made our statements. They made Sam draw up a sketch of the guy, so they could relay the picture to the other officers to be on the lookout. Once everything settled down, Sam explained what happened, and it was truly horrifying to hear. He said that as he pulled into the Walmart, he saw a middle-aged man in his 50s wave him down. Sam parked next to him, and promptly got out to meet him. Tim, or whoever this person was driving a white van that had a painting company's name on the side. The guy told Sam that the PC was in the back, so he opened the doors for him to look in. As he did that, Sam was pushed into the van and the doors slammed shut. He took Sam to the house, which we later confirmed was abandoned, and tied him up at knife point in the basement. When the guy heard me yelling for Sam, he took off through the backyard. The van that Sam was kidnapped in was stolen, as the police later found out through surveillance footage. The story ended up making the news, even including a sketch in the surveillance footage, but the guy was never found. A few years back, when I was in college, I was selling the previous semester's required books on Craigslist. I was a college student, so I definitely needed whatever cash I could make from them. Anyways, I got a few offers, but they never went through, and at this point, I was getting pretty desperate. I had to sell those books as soon as possible, because the authors would usually release a new edition every year or so. I got this text message from a person who said that they wanted to buy all of my books. I simply assumed the individual was going for the same certificate as me, and required the same books for those professors. Looking back, I was a complete idiot. At first, the person wanted to meet up at my place. I was desperate, but not completely stupid. I instantly objected and offered a more suitable location, such as the campus. The person said they lived in the opposite direction and said it would be preferable if we could meet halfway. I figured that it was another poor college student who couldn't spend much on gas. I agreed and sent a location that seemed to be public enough. I chose a gas station that I was familiar with. One of my friends from high school would often work late there. I requested that we could meet anytime from 12 p.m. to 3 p.m., simply because I had night classes to study for. I also don't like meeting up with strangers at night. The day of, I got about 10 texts from the person, who was constantly apologizing that they couldn't make it in that time frame. They begged me to meet at 10 p.m., explaining that they were caught up at work. I genuinely felt bad for the individual, and I agreed, even though it would be after my class and really late. After class let out at 9:30, I ended up driving on the highway to the gas station, which was about 15 minutes away. I arrived around 9:45, so I had a bit of time to spare. I pulled out some notes to review them, since we had a unit exam in 2 days. 10 o'clock passed, and there was no sign of the buyer until I got a text that said, "Hey, I can't make it to our meetup spot. Can we meet here instead?" Annoyed, I looked on my map and saw that it was an auto body repair shop. I figured, why not, but I noticed I was another 10 minutes out. Since I really needed the money, I told him yes and drove out there. Now, I didn't know the area we were meeting in, but it had a ton of one-way streets and back alleys. It definitely wasn't a good area, and it creeped me out to the max. Once I arrived at the destination, I got another text from them saying that it was in the back alley behind the shop. Not only that, but it was a one-way street, nighttime, and located in a bad neighborhood. I texted the person, asking where they were and that I need to get back home soon. There was no response. I sat there waiting until I received a response 10 minutes later. All the text said was, "Almost there." At this point, I was beyond ticked off and just focused on getting back home. Then, almost like they were spamming me, I started to get a ton of texts from the person saying, "Almost there, almost there." It was at that point where a completely blacked out SUV rolled up coming down the street from the wrong way. Their headlights were completely off. All the windows were completely tinted with at least 5% tinting. I panicked inside as I watched 4 people wearing hoodies get out of the car. Then, I panicked even more as I tried thinking of any possible way I could get out of there. I couldn't go forward because their SUV was blocking the road in front of me. I threw the car in reverse and floored it out of there. Once I got to the T intersection of that street, I looked at them for a split second and they just stood there, with hoods hanging over their eyes. I figured it wasn't worth the risk of $100 and just left. Needless to say, I left knowing for next time to bring another individual, never meet at night, regardless of their circumstances, meet in a well-known area, and not to risk your life for some extra change. I had lived with my roommate in an apartment for the past 3 years. Just to give a bit of information about myself, I was 25 years old at the time and finishing up the process of fully becoming a cop. My roommate and I were best friends growing up, but as time went on, our friendship grew further apart. We ended up getting into a huge argument one night that ultimately led to him moving out, leaving me with the full payment of the rent. I was in desperate need of money, but couldn't find a better paying job than the one I currently had. I needed to find a way to get by for 3 months until I was a cop. Out of desperation, I made a Craigslist posting, looking for a roommate who would be willing to pay for half the rent each month. The next day, I got a message from an individual who was interested. Looking back now, this is extremely foolish of me, but I invited him over to take a look at the apartment. I had no idea who this person was or what they looked like. My desperation to not lose my apartment was greater than my safety. I agreed to have him over at 6 p.m. after I got off work. The sun went down, and I stood by my balcony door waiting for him to arrive. A few minutes after 6, I noticed a very old pickup truck pull in and park in front of my unit. I ran downstairs to let him in. As I opened the door, the first thing I noticed was that this guy reeked. I wasn't sure if he was homeless or what, but I didn't want to judge him based off of that. He introduced himself as Jerry, and I took him upstairs so he could take a look around. He seemed to be on the quiet side, but overall, he was nice and didn't seem like he'd be much of a nuisance living with him. After some time talking about the place and looking around, he said he was interested. I gave him my terms, which were very straightforward and simple. Since we'd be splitting the rent, he would have to pay me $700 on the first of every month, take care of his dishes, and leave his shoes at the door. We made a verbal agreement, and he told me he'd be back by tomorrow to move in. Well, the next day came around, and I got off at 5. I texted him saying that I was waiting for him whenever he was ready, but there was no reply. Hours went by, and I started to assume he was backing out. I went to bed around 10 and had trouble sleeping, knowing I was very close to getting evicted if I didn't find a roommate. A couple hours went by, and I continued to toss and turn. All of a sudden, as I was finally drifting asleep, I was startled awake to hear a knock on my door. I looked at my clock, and it was after 12:15. I got up to see who it was, and surely enough, it was Jerry. He was holding a suitcase and at least 5 or 6 plastic bags with random stuff in it. I asked why he didn't come earlier, and he just kind of grunted and walked past me, faintly muttering, "Had a rough day." I didn't want to annoy him anymore, but I reminded him that tomorrow was the 1st, and I needed $700 by then. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of cash. I thanked him and took it. After trying to settle him in, I told him I was going to bed and went to my room. I continued to have trouble sleeping, just like earlier. The stress from the new living situation and the strangeness of Jerry coming over in the middle of the night was unsettling. I ended up having the worst sleep of my life. The entire night, I heard Jerry talking on the phone. I couldn't make out any of the words, but he sounded extremely serious. I kept hearing the door to my apartment open and close, but I just assumed he was grabbing stuff from his truck. I laid there, listening to the commotion he continued to cause. This is when things started to take a dark turn. Around 3:30 a.m., still awake, I heard Jerry talking in the living room. This time was very different though. Every time he spoke, it sounded like I could hear a response from another person. I froze, trying to listen to the conversation. It was still hard to hear, but the person Jerry was talking to seemed really mad. I decided to play it casual and walked out to the living room area. As I stepped out, Jerry and another complete stranger were standing there. The stranger looked at Jerry, saying, "Who is this?" and he reached out and pointed a gun at me. I literally felt like I was in a weird dream, but I put my hands up, explaining that I lived here and Jerry just moved in with me. Then he approached me and said, "Where's the money?" I didn't know what he was referring to, but I didn't want to risk asking. I gave him the money Jerry gave me out of my wallet. He stood there, counted it, and left, slamming the door shut behind him. I looked at Jerry, who was sitting there, frozen and profusely sweating, and said, "Care to explain?" as I dialed 911. As I got on the phone with dispatch, Jerry ran into his room and closed the door. I stood there, trying to explain everything that had just happened. All of a sudden, Jerry came flying out of his room with all his bags and promptly left. Once the police showed up, they got the full story and began an investigation. They were able to get Jerry's fingerprints and told me that he already had a warrant out for his arrest. A couple days later, I learned that the police caught him and arrested him. They ended up getting the full story from him about the events of that night. He robbed a drug dealer, who he apparently knew very well, so he could get off the streets. Somehow, the dealer tracked him to my place, looking for his money. This story haunts me to this day, knowing that I could have very well been killed that night. Just take it from me, and never try to find a roommate through Craigslist.